Hello class, and welcome to our introductory lecture for our unit on war, religion, ethics, and war. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about Mathewes' Dilemma. That is a dilemma which is raised by the author of our textbook, Warren Mathewes. Then we're going to define the terms war and just war. We'll talk a little bit about just war theory and just war as a theological dilemma. So according to chapter 13 of our text, Mathewes argues that no religious tradition is purely militant nor purely pacifist. That is, when students take this class, I find that they usually fall into one of two camps. Either one, students think that war and religion are synonymous, that religions are militant and pro-war, pro-war, pro-war. So religion and war are synonymous with one another. Whereas others see, religions as belief systems of peace and that they are purely pacifist or anti-war. Well, what Mathewes is saying is that folks who belong in those two camps are actually half right. That is, religious traditions are both militant and pacifist at the same time. And this is a dilemma because it's a paradox. How can religion both be in support of war and also be anti-war? So one thing to think about is, one, is Mathewes correct in his perception of religion? And two, if he is correct, then how are we to interpret this paradox? All right, so now that we've touched upon Mathewes' dilemma, let's go about and define some of the terms that we're going to be using in this unit. So the most obvious one that we should start with is the term war. So war, a general definition of this, is that it refers to a state of usually open and declared armed hostile conflict between states, nations, or groups. And war can involve the killing of military personnel as well as civilians. So this is kind of what we might call like a traditional understanding of war as kind of like an open, declared confrontation between organized political bodies or groups. And war is usually distinguished from terrorism, which refers to the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. So whereas war is what we might refer to as lawful, open, and declared conflict, terrorism is kind of like the unlawful use of violence for usually some kind of political aim. And according to the FBI website, terrorism involves groups that espouse extremist ideologies of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. So terrorism is synonymous with extremism and extremist ideologies. Now, in the 21st century, something that's being discussed in academia is whether the landscape of war is changing. So that is, the question is our conception of war as a kind of legal, open and declared conflict between political entities, is this an outdated definition of war? And because of the American wars in the Near East, for example, we're finding that maybe the definition of war needs to be updated. So just something for us to think about because it's being discussed in the academy. So now that we have some understanding of what the term war means and some of the implications of that definition, what is a just war? Well, a just war refers to a war that is considered morally justified and leads to a moral end. So put plainly, a just war is an ethical war that results in some good. Now, a couple of philosophical questions are raised with respect to this term just war. The first one is the following. Is there such a thing as a just war? That is there such a thing as an ethical war, or is war always unethical? And if there is such a thing as a just war, how do we determine whether a war is ethical or not? Well, according to Charles Mathewes, the author of our textbook, for a war to be considered just or moral, it must follow three major criteria and an additional four guidelines. So in order for a war to be ethical or just, a belligerent party must follow three major criteria. One, the party going to war must be a legitimate or lawful authority, so it must be some kind of like a formal political entity. Two, the party must show just cause, so the enemy must be violating or attacking the rights of the party. So if I'm just invading another country for its resources, then that is not a just cause. A just cause would be maybe if the enemy attacked me or somehow oppressing my country. And thirdly, the party must possess the right intention, which is to bring peace or justice to the world. So if the belligerent party only wants to terrorize another nation, then that is an unjust intention. The right intention is that the conflict must result in some kind of peace or justice. And then Mathewes also refers to four additional guidelines. For war to be just, it must be the last resort. And albeit imperfect, some justice must result from the conflict. Thirdly, the benefits of the war must outweigh the cost. So if a country is going to war and it's a suicide mission, then of course the benefits are not going to outweigh the cost. And fourthly, there must be reasonable hope of success or victory. So there has to be some kind of calculated risk that's taken where the hope of success or victory is actually reasonable. So as we can see in the Western philosophical tradition, there is a certain amount of reasoning behind this claim that there does exist such a thing as a just war, as according to Mathewes' guidelines. But now let's talk about a theological dilemma. Is there such a thing as a just war in the eyes of God? Well, theologians are divided on this question. So according to theologians who are just war theorists, like the 5th century theologian and philosopher St. Augustine, yes, there is such a thing as a just war in the eyes of God. Why? Because some wars are morally good, and God will sometimes approve or even sanction war for the greater good. According to realists, however, like Reinhold Niebuhr, no, there is no such thing as a just war in the eyes of God. That is, war is always evil, but Niebuhr adds that it is sometimes a necessary evil. So God never approves of war, it is a sin, but sometimes humans have to engage in it for the greater good. So God does not approve of war, never sanctions war, but sometimes in human life it is necessary. And lastly, according to pacifists like Stanley Hauerwas, is there such a thing as a just war in the eyes of God? No. For Hauerwas, war is always evil in the eyes of God, and is only self-giving, non-resistant love that is the solution to armed conflict. So as we can see, our theologians are divided. Just war theorists think that yes, there is such a thing as a just war in the eyes of God. Realists say that no, it's never justified by God, but sometimes it's necessary. And for pacifists like Stanley Hauerwas, God would never ever sanction of war and is always an evil thing. It is never something that is sometimes necessary. So here's some overarching questions for us to consider in this unit. Is Mathewes' dilemma accurate? That is the position on war and morality a paradox in the religious traditions that we are going to study? Is it a mix of pacifism and militancy? Second, let's think about our philosophical question. Is there such a thing as a just war? Some argue that yes, an ethical war is possible, whereas others say no, war is always an evil. And thirdly, let us consider our theological question. Is there such a thing as a just war in the eyes of God? So again, just some things for us to contemplate as we study our course material.